Hi, good evening, everybody. My name is Mark Raymond, and I'm the director of the Graduate School of Architecture at the University of Johannesburg. And I'm here this evening with Melanie Archer, who is joining us from Port of Spain in Trinidad. And I'd like to welcome you to the practice lecture series. So this is the fourth of our practice lecture series. And it's a series of lectures in which we invite practitioners to share their practices with the school and to share not just the products of their practices, but the way in which they do their work, their motivations, their foundations, what their preoccupations are, and really what drives them in their practice. And we have practitioners across a wide range of geographies and disciplines and different ways of working. And joining us, as I said, from Port of Spain is Melanie. Hello, Melanie. And I'd like to welcome Melanie for joining us this evening. I'm going to introduce her in a little more detail in a minute, but just to also announce that the next in the lecture series will be Engelan Fal. Engelan is the Unit 7 leader at the Graduate School of Architecture and also the Making and Practice convener. And she will be speaking on the 13th of August at 6 o'clock at this same time. And in terms of the protocols around the meeting this evening, a couple of things to observe. If you could just make sure that if you're attending this, that you keep your camera off and you keep your microphone turned off. We can turn them off from here, but if you just remember to do it, it makes the management of the meeting much easier. That's the first thing. The second thing, there are three things I want to mention. The second thing is if you have any questions or if you have any comments on Melanie's presentation, please feel free to drop them into the chat, comments or questions, so that we can share them at the end. I'll moderate the Q&A at the end. And also, if you have any questions at the end, just raise your hand and I'll be able to, we'll be able to sort of allow you to direct those questions directly at Melanie. Yeah, I think that's it. And CPD points, we will post the link for the CPD points after the presentation. So for those of you who'd like to get continuing professional development points, you'll be able to do so. Just look out for the link at the end of the session in the chat. So let me introduce Melanie. Melanie Archer, who I've known for many years, is an artist, designer of books, aficionado of art and cultural production, many things. But Melanie started her practice by studying architecture at Hampton University in Virginia in the United States. And says that she went on to never practice architecture a day in her life, which is a curious description for the introduction that somebody studied architecture, but has studied other things. She's always been really interested in books, illustrated books and fine arts. She did an MFA, Master of Fine Arts, from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. And after graduating from there, she worked as a managing editor for a book publisher in New York, and then returned to Trinidad and Tobago, where she's currently based in a studio in Port of Spain. She's built a practice that primarily focuses on editorial book design, but also includes curating, branding, design management, art book publishing, and writing about art and design. My library has many of the books that Melanie's published, and I've also had the privilege and pleasure of working with and collaborating on a number of publications. She also has a really wonderful space in the middle of Port of Spain, a co-working space, an area called Woodbrook. She's had some experience teaching. She's taught in the Department of Creative and Festival Arts at the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine, which is where I was before I came here. And she also did some lectures to students on the urban design course that I taught at UWE. And she says that no matter what her current focus is at any given time, it's driven by a strong desire for collaboration and for the documentation and representing of Caribbean stories, that those are ideas that remain at the heart of her practice. I'm really looking forward to learning more from Melanie about the story of her practice and her sharing some of her really quite extraordinary work with us this evening. And as I said at the end, if any of you have any comments or questions, there'll be an opportunity for that at the end. So Melanie, welcome. I'm going to turn off my camera now, and I'm going to hand over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Mark. And thanks to the rest of the GSA team and to everybody who's joining today. Well, it's this evening, your time. It's the middle of the day, my time. I am based in Port of Spain, as Mark said. I'm hearing the thunder rolling in. It's the middle of the rainy season. Hopefully it holds up for the duration of the talk. So I'm going to get started by saying that this is always a deeply uncomfortable thing for me, because my belief is that your work should speak for itself. I've said that constantly. I say it to people all the time. And, you know, so I just want to say that, you know, I'm really uncomfortable right now. You know, I'm not really a person who is just out there front and center. But one of the good things about talks like this is that it's a great opportunity to examine your own work and to see the themes that have always been present. So I just want to talk a little bit about the title of the lecture. It came from speaking with Mark, actually, before the lecture. He was telling me what would be useful, what he thought that students would gravitate to. And one of the things that he said to me that really resonated was that architecture is not some sort of modern construct or something of the Western world, but it's something that has existed everywhere forever. And I thought that that was a really beautiful statement. And I think the same thing about design, actually. And I started thinking about how that ties into my own design practice, the concept of design being in everything I do and hopefully enduring. Hopefully it's going to be around forever. But it's also one of those things that's in our everyday. It's in all of our systems. It's in things we use. It's just so present. So it was really, I was really glad Mark said that, because it just, you know, it sparked the title. So my work has been a mixture of the following. This is definitely not a good representation in terms of balance. Book design should be gigantic right now. Everything else is sort of much smaller. But the common thread throughout has been that I've worked pretty independently, with a few exceptions, and we'll talk about those later. So by way of introduction of my practice, we're going to start with where I am today, which is literally in Port of Spain. And then we're going to take a big step back all the way to childhood. And, you know, one of the things in doing exercises like this, where you're asked to give a lecture, is that you really start examining things that affected you that you hadn't realized at the time. So it also makes sense for me to start talking about Trinidad, because it's really difficult for me to think about my practice without thinking about the place. So as Mark said, I'm based in Woodbrook, which is one of the 7 districts of the capital city, which is Port of Spain, of Trinidad and Tobago. So this is kind of what it looks like, aerial view. And I'm right there. I zoomed into the photo to find my building somewhere in there. So yeah, so on the left, you know what, one of the things about my practice is I feel as though, you know, I can't take it out of, you know, the rest of my life. Everything feels like it's really holistic. So on the left is somewhere that I go to swim every Saturday, and it's almost like a palate cleanse for the week. I just kind of wipe the slate clean. I think, I float, I, you know, think about work a little bit, but not too much. And also nature and the role that plays for me as well. So a little bit about Trinidad and Tobago, because I realize some people may not be too familiar. So for me, at least, it can be a place of some real contradictions. So it's a deeply religious society, and in many ways quite traditional. This is the interior of the Church of the Assumption by Anthony C. Lewis. But then we have Carnival, which is like the greatest show on earth, widely considered one of the biggest carnivals there is. And it's a kind of time of bacchanal and drama and all of these things. And the two things sit in opposition to each other. But then Ash Wednesday, which is the day after the big celebration, people are back in church for their ashes. It's a place where the education system is focused really heavily on academics, but there's also legendary creative output, such as the work of Francisco Cabral. And of course, there's you know, the sports teams really, you know, it's cricket, football, Music plays a big role in our society as well. The steel pan was invented here. The only musical instruments have been invented in the 20th century. And Trinidad can also be a place of magic and wonder. There's a yearly flowering of the kui trees. They're pink and yellow. This is around the Queen's Park Savannah, which we'll talk about. But then again, in opposition to this, we have issues as well. There's epic traffic, a rising crime rate. There's significant systemic infrastructural failures. Like, I'm listening to the rain starting to come down, and I'm just thinking it's going to start flooding. It's an economy that's also relied on oil and gas, and now there's a question of longevity that's being faced. But then there's the flip side of that, where there's Tobago. It's beautiful. It's, you know, the place that all of Trinidad goes to get away from Trinidad. But our overall economy isn't reliant on tourism due to oil and natural gas reserves. And then at the buildings, so like most countries that were colonized, we have buildings that speak to those times, such as the Magnificent Seven around the Queen's Park Savannah, which is a large green space that's used as a park recreationally. And then the traditional style houses, which are remnants of architecture from French, you know, we were colonized by the French, the Spanish, and the English. So there's a bit of that everywhere. Sometimes these modern buildings are playing against the older buildings are playing against modern ones. Sometimes the contrast doesn't work, but there are places where it can feel really well executed, such as this instance. This is the old fire station in downtown Port of Spain with the new National Library behind it. So I'm gonna kind of zone in a little bit now and talk about my practice. So like I said, it's based in Woodbrook, which is widely considered to be the artistic center of Port of Spain. And my favorite coffee shop is District, which is just down the street for me. And there are a lot of cultural icons who live in Woodbrook. There's Mailing, fashion designer. There's Three Canal, which is a rap soul music band. There's a performance space called Big Black Box, which is nearby. There's lots of nightlife. And I live near to one of the oldest bars in Port of Spain, arguably the oldest bar in Port of Spain, which is Brooklyn Bar. There are a number of art galleries within walking distance, including Medulla Art Gallery. And but the urbanization of Woodbrook is starting to be a real concern. You can kind of get an idea of what the land use division is here, with the red being residential and the bright yellow being commercial. And what's happening is that there's a creep of commercial from this main artery of Arapita Avenue, which runs through Woodbrook. So there's a lot of nightlife, the questionable beautification efforts. You know, all of a sudden somebody will just drop some planters with some trees, and then somebody would start paving a road, trying to make it more friendly for pedestrians, but using a paving surface that people are falling on when it rains. So, you know, there's a lot of contradiction going on. There's a Woodbrook Residents Committee that keeps fighting to maintain Woodbrook as a residential space and to have that acknowledgement, noise levels and things like that. But all of that to say it's bustling, and I'm just in the middle of it. So my building has been a constant of my practice. My family purchased it in 2005, I think the year before I moved back to Trinidad. So upstairs is mine for living and working. And it's really interesting and central to my practice because I feel as though things are just constantly happening around me that, you know, you may not think that things are affecting you, but Sunday, for instance, I was in the studio putting together these slides, and then I started hearing music and I thought, well, what's going on? And I hadn't realized that the Pride Parade was coming up my street that day. So it's great for that. You know, you come out on your balcony, you know, you wave and you say, hey guys, and then, you know, you go back inside, and that happens with several parades. Things are just always happening. And I feel like I'm the center of things. Every now and then there's some public urination on the wall outside, you know, it's just distressing, or somebody will throw a beer bottle over the wall. But what I've tried to do is create a relative oasis in the midst of all of the madness. And while my relationship with Woodbrook is more and more complex, I don't think I'm ready to leave yet. I really love that I'm in the middle of it all. So just to walk you around my building a bit, downstairs at present, there's a lot going on. Renovating a formerly commercial space to turn it into an Airbnb. It's a work in progress, and I'm working with two architects, Jennifer Smith and Dion Wilson of Smith and Wilson. And people are like, well, why didn't you just design it yourself? And then I've had to remind them that like, it's an architecture practice, with practice being the really key word, and that's not my practice. So while I have an architecture degree, it would be a really not good thing for me to try to take that on. Also downstairs is Ashraf, who owns, he's an artist, he owns a frame shop and a small gallery, and he's really spent a lot of time and energy over the past few years converting the space into a really beautiful space. This is Ashraf, and in his window, there's a line of blue bottles, and there's this belief in Trinidad that there's a maljo blue, which maljo is when somebody puts a bad eye on you, they look at you and they don't want you to do well. So Ashraf has this line of blue bottles in his window and a hummingbird feeder. There's a hummingbird that's been coming by recently. But there's always an influx of artists and creative people, which, I can't describe what that feels like. You just walk outside of your house and then there's somebody amazing downstairs. You get to interact with them and it's a space that always feels so alive. And then one of the other aspects is my garden, which I've developed as a space for interaction, but it's also really, it's an oasis. I go down there, I sit down on the bench. This bench is by making, which I'll talk a bit more about. It's really just I love it. I love it as a green space because it feels very concrete and commercial around me. So it's a space, and one of the really nice things that I find sometimes is I look outside and I see somebody who's come into Ashraf just sitting under the tree and enjoying the space. It really is one of those areas that helps me to clear my mind, and I don't know what it would be like without it. And then I have to give a little shout out to Carlitos, who's a stray rooster who wandered into our yard from, there's a square block away. And he stayed with us until, unfortunately, he was killed by stray dogs last year. But he had girlfriends across the street and he was becoming like a whole thing. He Three Canal, who lives across the street from me, they have chickens, and he would go visit his girlfriends every morning. He'd get chased by Wendell and Roger, and then he would come back and sleep in the same tree. So he was a really, somehow he added something to the space. But while Carlos was random and unexpected, the garden has served intended purposes. So at left, it's a space being used for a new media program of experimental films with the Trinidad and Tobago Film Festival. And at right, a gathering for tech company UnQ. And I'll give more about both of those things later as well. It's also been a space for daytime interaction, such as commerce, launches. At left is Robert and Christopher Publishers and Film Co. and the Trinidad and Tobago Film Festival, sharing a space, again, on a portable stand made by Making. And at right is a product launch for By Making's Bloom, which is those plant pots that you're seeing hanging in the background. I worked with Marlon Darbo, who is the founder and the creator behind By Making, and he's going to be giving a talk on August 20th as part of the practice lecture series. So, it's been a life that is very much about interacting and building these relationships. And then there's my home, which is very important to me as well. It's a place I've been collecting Caribbean art for some time now. And I live my life surrounded by books and art, which really ground me. And while I don't like to work at home, so my building is L-shaped, I don't have a connector upstairs between my home and my studio, but I both of the spaces are filled with beauty as much as possible. And so a lot of art from the Caribbean, and it's just a space that I love. The light is really beautiful in the morning. And then there's my studio where I'm speaking to you from today. So I'm in the meeting room, which is that door to the left of the photograph. And the space itself holds 8. It was conceived as a co-working space, which hasn't been so operational recently as a co-working space, but more on that later. You'll notice that there are flowers. So as soon as you come in, I buy flowers every week for the space. It's really important to me, just as a point of beauty as soon as you enter. There are also some books, not just my books, but books that I like that, people are welcome to come in, sit down if they're waiting on somebody and just take a browse. And I rotate those regularly. And you get extra points if you can spot my dog in this photo. He's always in here with me. He's actually under the chair now. So that's kind of my physical space. So I'm going to move on a little bit by moving back to talk about my education and how it's helped determine what my practice is today. So I grew up in Glencoe, which is a suburb of Port of Spain, went to Catholic primary school and secondary school. And there's always, like I said, a focus on academic excellence. And in Trinidad, you go from primary school, you have to write an entrance exam to get into secondary school. So there's a lot of pressure on you academically to do well from early on. And there were obviously challenges, but I always gravitated towards art. I always loved books. And I realized only maybe about 5 or maybe 7 years ago now, when I was asked in an interview what prompted me to get into books, I realized it's back to this moment. So this is my elder sister, Paulette, and me. And whenever we did well in school, we got a book as a prize. So there's a prize giving ceremony. You went up and you got your book. And I came to see books as treasures, as prizes. And one of the books I got back in 1984 is still on my bedside table today. I've held on to it. It's one of my most precious books. So I always loved architecture, and I would sketch buildings as a child. I don't have any of those sketches, but these are from my teenage years when I was just trying to start developing a style. And in secondary school, I did O-levels for art. And one of the things we did is we had to produce a little book on a local artist and practitioner. And I selected Robert Young of a brand called The Cloth that is in existence today. And it's a relationship that I've maintained up until today. I'm actually wearing a shirt by Robert for this lecture. And then in A-levels, also doing art, we had to keep a book called a coursework sketchbook. And I remember going to the government printery to get, we had our books custom made, and you got to select what kind of paper you wanted, and you got to see how they stitched it. And one of the things that we had to do was to keep a record of what resonated with us. So we would go to exhibitions. We would also do newspaper clippings from the Sundays, which had the art section. And it was only pretty recently in, kind of going back through that book, actually it was yesterday, I'm fooling, when I was, looking for 1 or 2 additional slides, I realized that one of the articles that I'd clipped, this is from 1993, is, I think maybe 1995, it was on an art book, and it was talking about Geoffrey McLean, who was one of the sort of figureheads of the contemporary art scene. He had a gallery called Aquarella, which later became Medulla, with his partner, Martin Muté. And I clipped this, and it talks about a book that Geoffrey had done on Bosco Holder, who is one of, I don't know if you guys have heard about this exhibition at Victoria Miro Gallery in London now, which is Bosco Holder and Geoffrey Holder, a pair of brothers from Trinidad and Tobago, highly creative. It's an exhibition of their paintings. But this was a book on Bosco Holder, and I wrote, I have seen the book, excellent, good show of the artist through the ages. I don't know who I thought I was at 15 or 16 writing about this, but this really connected with me. And one of the things that also connected with me, and I went back to this article yesterday, and I realized how much of an effect it had on me, because I highlighted this portion that spoke about books being made locally, and that this book was made locally. And that's one of the things that made it special, because a lot of the times we're not actually producing the books we make locally. So another pivotal moment was my mother taught English, and she worked with the daughter of one of Trinidad's preeminent architects at the time, Colin Laird. And she arranged for me to meet him. She knew I had an interest in architecture. And, I think the first time I met him, I was 16, and I was just absolutely fascinated with his workspace. One of the big things was music. He had all of these rows and rows of CDs. And I remember walking in and listening to, it was jazz that was playing, and looking at his workspace. And it was just so beautiful. And it got me to think, wow, it must be easy to create such amazing work when you work in a space that looks like this. So I continued to visit Colin. I mean, obviously you need to have some skill as well, right? But I continued to visit Colin throughout my degree, and he was always so welcoming when I came home. And I went to see him, and it was just a sense of extreme generosity. He shared everything about his practice with me. And well, not everything, no financials or anything like that, but he spoke to me like I was I don't know, an adult, which I think was probably the first person to do that at that time. So Colin was known for the most exquisite drawings. And I remember thinking about, oh, the sense, it's so meticulous. And this is his drawing of the National Library, which we would have seen a photo of earlier. And based on the dates, I think that this must have been on his desk during my visits, but I actually don't remember seeing it at any point in time, but I would reconnect with it later in my journey. So off I went to architecture school. I went to Hampton University in Virginia, which is a historically Black college and university. They had an accredited program at the time, a Bachelor of Architecture, which was 5 years. So, I was coming from a place where Trinidad's population is 1.3 million. I didn't want to go to anywhere that was so large because I came from a relatively small space. I also think that one of the reasons I chose Hampton is the proximity to water. When I look at, where I've lived, it's always just so close to water. And I think it was really important for me at that point in time. The bottom photograph is Bemis Labs, which is the building that the architecture department was housed in and where I spent so much time. Any architecture student would know it's late nights, it's grueling. My mother reminded me recently that she said, you called me tearfully one day and you said, Mom, it's just so much work. And she said, but Melanie, you knew it was going to be a lot of work. And I said, yeah, but it's a lot of work. But one of the things that I think was really good was that Bemis built a sense of community for me. And I don't know if this is the same with people who are working more in a digital realm. I was kind of right at that cusp of the transition from hand drawings to digital. So we had, the boards, we had the draft boards, we were just drawing, we were looking at each other's drawings, we were interacting, we were bouncing ideas off of each other. And that feeling that you're in the trenches together, you're not working on exactly the same project, but there's somebody who is nearby who is just understanding what you're going through. Also important to me at Hampton were two teachers, Ron Sakel and Sally Hutt. They were just very encouraging. I tried to take freehand drawing for architects as a class and they wouldn't let me do it unless I was a TA. And so I TA'd for them. And they moved to New Mexico, I think in my 3rd year. And I ended up spending a couple of summers out there with my boyfriend at the time, who was also in architecture school. And we were best friends and thick as thieves. And we did a couple of projects, one of them in Roswell, New Mexico, just looking at urban spaces. And one of the things that they were keen on was documenting your work and kind of having a multidisciplinary practice. So they encouraged us to make postcards. So they would have encouraged the making of this postcard, which is a model from, kind of conceptual creative space that I was trying to conceive in Port of Spain, as well as a painting. I was doing a lot of painting at that time and sketches as well. One of the things I remember about Ron and Sally is that they were always very, very, very encouraging. And they were also another example of seeing people in these creative spaces who had really beautiful physical spaces and kind of making that link, the idea that this is not, the things you can't separate, the beautiful space from the beautiful practice. And I also remember they gave me my first and only B+ in studio because they thought I phoned it in and they said that, you could do better. We could have given you an A, but we're going to give you a B+ to learn your lesson. And I learned my lesson. So, somewhere in the 3rd year, I realized I don't want to do this. I don't want to practice architecture. It's not quite what I thought. There's not like the sense of enormous freedom. There's rules and restrictions and codes and things. But I didn't know what my next steps were. So I just said, let me finish the program. And one of the things that happened during the program was that we went out to Walt Disney Imagineering for a competition. There was a call for competition for underrepresented architecture students to design things for the parks, right? So we were selected as finalists, flown out there, and everybody did interviews. And most of my friends were interviewing with Imagineering itself in the design department, but I asked to interview with the art library. I thought, that's kind of interesting. So I was called back out. I got the internship. So I spent a year between my undergrad and grad, just kind of being in Glendale, learning what it meant to archive and document, how to name your files correctly. It was also my first time on a Mac. I worked with two amazing people, Denise Rutledge Brown and Mike Jusko, and they really, they just, I mean, the systems were so clear that it made me kind of understand the value and importance of systems. So I didn't know my next step, so I got another degree. So I went off to the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. And when I was in secondary school, I had an amazing art teacher, Mrs. Edwards. And at that point in time, all you were doing was looking through brochures for schools. There's no online, there's none of that. And she had a really beat up copy of this brochure for the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. And she said, it's the best art school in the US. I think you should go if you ever have the opportunity. So I applied and I got in through the interior architecture program. And I learned a lot of lessons in Chicago. It was my first time living in a city, and a city of that size, and having access to events. I would go to lunchtime classical music concerts at the cultural center. I would marvel at the detail of the architecture. Spent a lot of time at Lake Michigan. One of my friends said recently to me, you don't choose your teachers. And what he meant by that was that you don't really have a stake in who is going to influence you. But I did choose this one teacher quite literally, because I was in her class and she completely changed my entire life. So I met her at the Art Institute of Chicago, and her name is Maud Lavin. She was just whip smart. She had come through the math program at Harvard and was one of the first women to take this complicated math sequence. But here she was teaching at an art school, and I got from her the sense that you can actually move from one thing to something completely different. But what she did is, we were in a class, I can't remember the name of the class I was taking with her, but she had another class called, I don't even know the name of that class either, but in that class, there was a discussion about whether Coca-Cola was responsible for the image of Santa Claus. And along came a project called The Business of Holidays. And my role on this project, which was looking at whether just how corporate America drives holidays for commercial gain. So we broke down all of the holidays, and my role changed from writing a couple of essays to being senior writer, associate editor, and then working as one of the designers. And this is not something I loved books, but it's just something that I never had on my radar as something that was possible for me. So it was really eye-opening. This is this is what the project looked like. I still have the sheets from correcting people's essays, but also things that were corrected when the actual editor from the publisher, which was Monticelli Press, got a hold of it. One of the best things about this project was the encouragement that I got from the rest of the team. And they were designers. They were coming in through design. They knew how to design. And they said to me, I expressed an interest in it. And they said, well, why don't you just design a few of the holidays? Because we broke it up, we designed specific holidays. And I said, well, I can't. I'm not, I don't know how to do it. And they said, well, yeah, but you're already a designer. You just need to learn the software. And that has stuck with me through so many things, this idea that you have a foundation that you can build on. It's just a matter of how are you learning, how, that output. So I love the process of working on this book, and it got me into editorial design with no formal training, as well as writing with no formal training. And it also helped me to start thinking through some things for myself. So my MFA final project was, I started working on artist books. So I was looking at the relationship of women in architecture, and I did a series of books of different formats. This is one of them called Misconceptions, just looking at, just how, that idea of, this came out of a very specific moment actually in architecture school, where I was literally standing in front of my drawings, and I had 4 different guys come up to me and say, wow, like these drawings are amazing. Who did these? And I'm standing in front of them, like everybody's standing in front of their work. So just this idea about, it doesn't look like it was done by a woman, and what that means exactly. So I went on from the Art Institute of Chicago to New York, where I worked for distributed art publishers. And I actually got into that job because a former student of Maud's was leaving the job. So she put in a good word. I got an interview, and based on the strength of the Business of Holidays, I got in as managing editor. And it was a really great time in New York. I had so much fun at that job. And I had a run-in with this painting that was also quite important for me, which was, it was a reopening of MoMA. I think it was 2005, maybe. They had gone through a renovation, and I was at the opening night celebration. And I rounded a corner and I saw this painting, and this is Peter Doig's painting La Perouse Wall. And La Perouse is the main cemetery. It's a large cemetery in Port of Spain. And, all of my family members who have died are buried in La Perouse. And I kind of had this moment where I was by myself in this, huge institution where everybody's just being very fancy. And I'm just there fighting tears and feeling a very strong connection to home. Not too long after this, unfortunately, I had a really tough lesson in getting laid off. I got laid off of the job that I moved to New York for. And then, it was the process of applying for various jobs and being almost there and having 3 jobs that really I was on the cusp of, and they broke my heart. And I decided to move back home because I also ended a very sort of long-standing relationship. And I just felt like the universe was pushing me back towards Trinidad, but I was convinced that there was nothing back at home for me. So, of course, that wasn't the case. And one of the things I did is I just started building connections even before I got back home. One of the things that I did before I got home was that I pitched a magazine. So Maud knew this guy named Jeremy Lear, who was working at Print Magazine, which is a big graphic design magazine in the US. And I wanted to talk about these FET posters, which are posters that are painted and stuck up on light poles in Trinidad, and how that played off of the work of Peter Doig, whose painting we just saw, who would have he would paint sort of signage for Studio Film Club, which was a film night that he ran with Che Loveless. And it was, so this was us. Yeah, so I pitched this article to Jeremy, and he said, yes, sounds great. And then, all of a sudden I was a published author in Print Magazine. So I came back home sort of with a copy of this magazine tucked under my arm. And it was really just, I didn't know where I was going. I was just so unsure of my next steps. So one of the things I did is I reached out to everybody I knew. So I knew Charlotte Elias, who was the founder of a space called CCA, which is the Caribbean Contemporary Art Center. And it existed on a compound called Fernandez, which was all distillery, rum distilleries, a large compound. And she converted one of the buildings, Building 7, into the space for art, but also within that space, there were a lot of other things happening. So I met great people. CCA was just filled with artist studios. So Che Loveless, again, who I mentioned, had a studio there. Peter Doig had a studio there as well. Studio Film Club was running there. So that was a weekly Thursday night get together, informal setting. And it really was a space that was very kind of open and just teeming with a sense of creativity and possibility. One of the key people in that space was Above Group, and they were pivotal for their show and tell sessions that they used to have, which, they would invite somebody to make a presentation about their work. It could be just very different things. Sometimes it was an artist. I remember there was one on rum and chocolate, and it really just kind of created a very strong sense of a creative community. And at the Writers Studio Film Club. Another thing is that I just went to everything. I went to all of the openings I could go to. I spoke to every single person I could talk to. And I started working with softbox gallery, in particular, designing exhibition materials. And it was a really good way to build my art collection. I also worked with Medulla and specific artists who were starting to see me as the girl to go to for the exhibition material things. I also started writing. So I would look at these connections that I was making in certain places and just pitch them. So there was a magazine called Mako, and Mako is a term for minding other people's business, a local term. So the magazine is called Mako, and every time I met an artist or practitioner who I felt like I connected with, I would pitch an article to them. So I pitched an article about Jasmine Gurvan, who's an extraordinary jeweler from Jamaica. I pitched something on Isabel Brash, who also has an architecture degree, did practice, but now she is like one of the preeminent chocolatiers in the region. She owns a company called Cocoa Bell Chocolate. And then there was Ember, who was one of the best, his studio was at TCA as well. And I remember him saying to me once, don't let them get in your reserve tank. He said, you look really tired, they're in your reserve tank, and you have to just preserve a little bit of energy for yourself. I also just got into more writing. Again, a connection through Maud, I ended up writing some of the entries for Biden's very large archive of graphic design. And then I developed some very meaningful connections. So one of them is with Nadia Huggins, who's an extraordinary photographer from St. Vincent's, one of my dear friends. And I just think, her work is quite astonishing. I also worked at ACLA, which is Anthony C. Lewis Associates. And it was one of the first times I worked within a system of brands. They had a pretty strong brand. And what I did with them was I kind of signed up for marketing and just started doing, kind of inched my way towards designing their books and things like that, because I didn't know anything about marketing. I think it was just a broad umbrella. So one of the things is, this idea of just saying yes. So when I was at ACLA, Brian Lewis, who is one of the directors at the time, said, we want to do a book on Anthony C. Lewis, which is Brian's father and the founding father of ACLA. And he said, we'll pull you off of your regular duties at the firm if you think this is something you can take on. And I said, yeah, sure. I just need to get this software. Now, I learned how to design on Quark, and InDesign had just switched over to being the industry standard. So I said to Brian, yeah, just get me this software and then I can start as soon as you get it. Within, I don't know, it feels like it was 2 days, Brian had gotten this software. He just called my bluff. And then all of a sudden I had to design a book, again, not knowing the software, but also with the comfort that, I could just learn the story, learning about end papers, learning how to balance large images, learning how to, call things out visually, make different sections. And I would eventually go on to work with Brian on 3 other books, I believe, and you see a couple of them later on. So the common thread that I was finding was the documentation and the representing of stories from the Caribbean. That was the thing that I was most drawn to, because every time I started working for any of these people, there were these extraordinary stories that were coming out that I just felt like, how is it, I feel like other people don't know as much about this as they should. And just the act of, every time you're designing something, you kind of become a researcher, right? You need to get into what it is. And so I really started gravitating towards those types of projects. And one of the lucky things one kind of lucky break was working with the Trinidad and Tobago Film Festival. I had started working with them just on one-off things for a couple of years, and then they were rebranded by Above Group in 2009. And then there was a transition year of 2010 where I took this new brand and I really just ran with it based on everything that Above set up. And it was really foundational for me. And what it opened up for me was the importance of brand and brand consistency and remaining focused, and also the fact that a brand is not what you say it is, it's what other people say it is. And how are you working on kind of you know, carrying this message through in everything that you did. And as the film festival grew, one of the things that I started realizing that I really like doing is breaking down information. This was our final report that formally we would send it to our sponsors as a Word document. And, you know, this way, you know, they're just a lot more engaged. And I just, again, gravitating towards that multi-page format. Other things that were important for me here as well, really just team building, you know, key projects and working with a team of amazing, often young people, and just building. We're building a brand, we're building a reputation for Trinidad, and you know, this kind of idea of something of high quality coming from here. And then I got to, you know, one of the things that I've liked in my practice is that I get to revisit things. So for the film festival in 2015, I think it was, we got Bruce, whose work I looked at in 2005, to paint us some signs. So we put them up around town, but there were such hits that people took them off of the poles. So we just had no promotion because people were taking them as collector's items. And then also continuing, you know, that connection with Studio Film Club as part of the film festival. And then there was new media, which is play and experimentation. You know, experimental film works and building relationships. Again, this is that medulla, and also learning how to articulate and talk about experimental film, which is a bit of a challenge for me at the time. But I eventually left the festival after a really big year in 2015. So I kind of came full circle with Colin and his work with public spaces, which is one of the projects that Professor Raymond and I would have worked on. And he asked me in 2011 if I'd be interested in helping to co-curate and design exhibition materials. And Mark had worked with Colin, and I was just absolutely thrilled for this opportunity. So I got to spend time with Colin again, and I got to really get a detailed look at his work and to work with a team of talented and really passionate people. So Public Spaces was held at the National Museum, and initially it was just meant to be 3 weeks. It ended up being 9 months. And it was a great curatorial team that included Mark and Sean Leonard, who is from a local practice called Cord. So I designed all of the materials for the show. Mark was a great guide, suggested this fold-out format, which I've used since. So just a short blurb on one side, opening up to a poster on the other side. That's Colin's drawing of Queen's Hall, which is a performance space in Port of Spain. So just taking you through some of the materials for the show. I'm aware that time is running a little low. So, okay, so years later, this was 2017, Public Spaces was in 2012. Colin's family wanted to work on a book on his work and asked me to, and of course I said yes. And one of the nice things is that because I had set up a system, you know, for the exhibition, it was easily transferred over to the book. I think you could look at the book and the exhibition and kind of feel like they might have happened at the same time, although they didn't, but some of the same things. So using the same workhorse font, which was Franklin Gothic, using yellow, which is a color that Colin really loved. And I think this is one of the, he used it in wayfinding a lot. And these big numbers that he used to have on his drawings. I remember his drawings always had these numbers on them. And yeah, I mean, I can't describe the feeling of being asked back, you know, like you've worked on something and then there's an expansion of what that work is. So based on, I mean, that's one side of things. And then moving on to 2012, well, moving kind of back to 2012, but based on Mannequin, I was asked by Mariel Brown, who was at that point the only editor at Roberts and Christopher Publishers, if I would come on board and work on books with her. So she was working this small publisher and had a not great experience with one of the books and was, I think, just trying to have somebody else there, which I understand because I don't want to do anything by myself. And it's always really great for me when I can collaborate with somebody and have those strengths brought to the table. So we decided that we were going to work on a series of books that are telling different stories, but they're from the English-speaking Caribbean. The first one was Pictures from Paradise, and that came about because we were sort of looking around at all of the interest in Caribbean photography that was happening at the time. There's a local space called Alicia that had a show called Shot in Kingston, which was Jamaican photographers. And then there was a show called Wrestling with the Image that was traveling the World Bank. So this was the first book Mariel and I worked on together. And Robert and Christopher Publishers was owned by somebody called Bobby Campbell, who owns one of our large printeries here, and he eventually turned it over to Mariel and me. He just, he said, there's no money in art books, and he's not incorrect. So we own Robert and Christopher Publishers, and it was really great to be back in that process of managing the production of a book and not really just, designing it only. So that was pretty amazing. And then Distributed Art Publishers, DAP, that I worked for, distributed it. And it was their first Caribbean title. They actually had to create a section because they had us under Latin America. And I said, well, it's English-speaking Caribbean. So, but yeah, I always have the distinction of being the first book in that very large publishers catalog from the Caribbean. And Pictures from Paradise went on to then become an exhibition at Contact, which is the largest photography festival in the world, public photography festival. It happens in Toronto, and it was, again, just remaining open. We had the director of Wedge Curatorial Projects, Ken Montague, reach out to us and say, would you be willing to, collaborate on an exhibition? And we said yes. And it was held in shipping containers on the lakefront, and really had, a lot of impact. And it was a beautiful project. We went to see it. We would have left, I think I wrote this article as well for Caribbean Beat, and again, tying back to writing. So all of the parts just kind of working together to just push this body of work that I didn't know was developing at the time. The second book that we worked on in the series is See Me Here, which was a survey of contemporary self-portraits. And again, just kind of trying to build this idea of documenting, the documentation of stories from the Caribbean, and creating a record and honoring artists. It's really important to me, all of the relationships that I've built with artists over the years, to keep honoring them. And then there was this absolute monster of a book, which is A to Z of Caribbean Art, that Mariel and I worked on over the course of 5 years. And it took a very long time, and there were some very hard lessons learned. One of the first ones was when we were looking, or I should just say, it's a kind of one page per artist. It's artists from English, French, Dutch, Spanish speaking Caribbean. And we had this massive, this kind of setup where we asked advisors in each of the territories, and we had a whittling process. We went into research, and when we were trying to raise funds to produce the book, we went to our government sports and culture fund because they had an opening for grants, and we got rejected. And what they said is that we didn't fall in the definition of culture. So it was really a struggle to sort of feel like you're doing work that belongs when, you're kind of getting told that, this isn't culture, this doesn't fall in the culture. But we pushed through, we did a lot of fundraising, and we got it done, But another one of the difficult lessons that I learned on this project was that not everybody necessarily wants you to do well. We actually had an advisor get on socials as the book was launching and just kind of talk about all of the things that should have happened, and, why hasn't this happened, and why did they choose this, and why didn't they choose this? And I thought, but you were right there, you could have said something. But it's a tough lesson. But one of the things that it made me realize is how important it is, to choose the right people for things. And to surround yourself with energy that's positive and genuinely supportive. So yeah, so I figured out kind of fairly recently that book design is what I really want, and I just tracked that all the way back to that conversation that I had with John Daniel. I'm just flipping through some of the books that I just did the covers for these. I wasn't going to go into particular detail. My website has all of the write-ups if you want to jump on there and check them out in detail. But there are one or two things that I would like to talk about. And the main thing that I want to talk about is this idea of process. I think the process makes things perfect. The very first part of my process, everybody says about writers that good writers are good readers. And I think that good designers are good readers as well. But you're reading visually. These are some of the, it's not even all of the books at home, but it's some of the books at home that I have at home. And, you know, every time I'm about to start designing a project, I just take something off a shelf and just start looking through it. And I'm not looking for specifics. I'm trying to jumpstart my brain into the process of designing and also figuring out what it is you're connecting with and figuring out why things work. It's looking is such an important part of my practice, and collecting books as well. And another important part is I have to go brain to paper. I can't do brain to digital. Every time I try to just jump onto the computer, it's a disaster. I have probably about 50 sketchbooks, and every project starts the same way with a crappy sketch on whether it's a piece of paper or in my notebook, just to kind of start mapping out, what things want to look like. And then one of the things that I work on as well is figuring out systems like color. So this is a book, Growing Up with Brooke, and these are the dominant colors, and they're taken from the Woodbrook office, which was the place where you used to go to pay your taxes in Port of Spain. And then this other book, Manifestations of Faith, that happened recently. Our meetings were at the Archbishop's house. So just pulling a palette from something that's very real, something that's very tangible. Developing a grid, coming up with a system for things, and then figuring out how that translates into chapters. How do you make a section opening? How do you, what are the special things that you can do? What's the grid you're building on? How much white space do you leave? And these are things, like I said, I didn't study, and I had really great teachers and the team of people that I worked with on the business of holidays, but that is the extent of my formal book design anything. So a lot of it has just been me figuring out what it is I connect to in books that I'm looking at, and just trying to make the information make sense for the reader. And then figuring out when something might need a special move. So for this book, this is a book, Manifestations of Faith, on churches and chapels in Trinidad, 13 of them. And one of the things that felt really important to me as the project progressed was to have little illustrations done, and those eventually became the end papers. Another thing being the team. We brought on Robert Clark, who's at the left of this project. This is Brian Lewis, who's a photographer who I worked with constantly, sitting next to me on the other side. And Brian and I have worked on so many projects together. But once I started seeing this book, kind of coming into being and realizing what it wanted to be, I felt like it needed some really strong writing about the churches to tell their stories, and Robert brought it to life. So it was also a matter of, again, trust and dynamics. I've worked with Brian for so long. We definitely have strong opinions. Brian has strong opinions, but he trusts me. So if I say to him, Brian, I don't think that works, or I think we need to bring on this person, then he will say, okay, well, let's make it happen. And it's just such a crucial and really important thing for your collaborations, is to have that sense of trust. This was another book I worked on recently. This was Mass Man, which is on the work of Peter Minshall, who is a preeminent figure in Trinidad and Tobago, it's Carnival, and Trinidad and Tobago in general. The Minshall Mass Foundation came to me saying that they wanted to start a series of books. So this is just about a 5x7 book. It's quite small, it's paperback. They wanted them to be in black and white. So figuring out how can you make an engaging book in black and white? And, you know, coming up with things like highlighting certain passages of text, just giving a lot of space to a drawing. I mean, the drawing that's in the center of this, I don't even know, you know, it's just the motion of a skirt. And somehow it just feels like it is, you know, it feels like it needed all of the space that it was given. So there will be more books in this series, and I just really was happy to sit down with the team and also be trusted to work on it. And it's one of those projects that felt very intimate. It happened, you know, whereas Manifestations of Faith probably happened over maybe almost 3 years. This came together, I think it was about 7 months, really quick, but just a wonderful project to work on. And one of the things that is important as well is this idea of realizing when you're being crazy, because at first I had a concept of, oh yeah, I can just work, you know, like with a light and dark theme. And then he's talking about things being halves of a circle. So maybe the text wants to be, and then I just looked at this thing. I was like, you can't actually read this. Like this would be a nightmare, like where things are happening with the text up at the front. So it's always good to take a step back and realize that, you know, your own, like, I mean, you just, I mean, you can do things like this as experiments, but presenting it to somebody, I mean, a book needs to be legible. So it's just that went out the window fairly quickly. Nobody's really seen this other than the people in the Minshall Moss Foundation. Another important thing for me is working with the team and what that means. So these were our postcards on the left from the A to Z crowdfunding campaign. That's Marielle and Richard, who is Robert and Christopher's designer. And Buddy the dog, their dog is there as well. Another really great collaborative effort recently was with Practice, who is, again, it's Marlon. If Marlon's here, he's probably like, gosh, this girl's just taking all my shine for my talk. But it was a book that they worked on Marshall Montano, and I was brought in sort of as a managing editor on it to be the bridge between Practice, who's designing, with Patrick, who is over to the left in the white shirt, and Marshall's mom, and also the printer, and to just kind of speak the same language for everybody. So that was a really amazing project. This is one of my favorite memories. This is when we got the proofs back from the printer, and we were just going through, marking everything up, making notes, just, you know, kind of going through and being meticulous, which is something that has always been really important to me, this stage of things. And I love this part of the process when things come back. One of the things on Manifestations of Faith, I was trying to have the illustrations be part of the contents page as well, and they just weren't working at the scale, and I had to let them go. And it's that process of learning to let things go. And on Massman is an example of, which is on the far right, an example of how detailed I can get, you know, with flagging issues. So orange being critical, must change, blue being should change, could live with and not die if it goes into print. And then understanding the process as well is very important to me, understanding how do you, what is the actual printing process? And one of the really great things about printing locally is being able to go in and see all of it. So in conclusion, winding down, taking you back to the studio and where I am today. So the recent history of the studio was Above Group, who moved in August 2016. So the same company that I spoke about earlier, who was at CCA 7 and doing the show and tell, they moved into the space. They were small at the time. I had one chair at the end. There were 7, and it was really amazing and lovely to work with them. So on the left, Garrett Jenkins, and again, Marlon. And the post I have from Anthony Burrell, which is work hard and be nice to people, which is something that I really try to live by. Worked with Above on brand writing, and they were in the studio for a while. And it was really nice because they would kind of like peep over and look at what they were doing. And but then eventually migration took a key player out of the picture, and I think the fracture was a bit too much, and they decided to give up a physical space. But I did inherit a couple of people who worked with Above Group. One of them, Melanie Archer, who is a type designer who you should know. I think, well, not I think, the first type designer from Trinidad, definitely. Giselle Carr, who has a company that deals with sustainability. And one of the nice things is Shannon Alkins, who is a friend of mine, but also works in books. And she has a company called Bright Eyed. She's making children's books. So while her books are very different kind of books from my books, there was a great synergy that was happening with her and me, and also with Plantain, who are Zaki and Felicia, who shared the space with me for a while as well. They were working on family history books, and but also doing amazing, beautiful work. And, you know, it was great to speak to people who can have that sense of problem solving that you have. It's really just quite wonderful. And the synergies that happen, you know, there was a shared moment once where Felicia accidentally hit update computer and all of us groaned because we knew it would be, you know, 15 minutes before she could get back to work and she had a presentation. Also worked with Carver Bacchus from Green Screen, which was an environmental film festival, and Marielle, who is with Savant, who makes documentaries also on Caribbean stories. And then there was UnQ, which is a company that I was a part of for quite some time, still technically I'm a part of, which was an online shopping and app developed in Trinidad by a JE, kind of leading that charge. And yeah, so UnQ has shared the space most recently, and Public Good Studio, which is a kind of a companion to UnQ, but they've since left, and I'm kind of, you know, just not really having many people in the studio and right now, and I do miss that. I mean, this is our Christmas party back in 2019, and in the studio I would always keep one seat free in case any of the regulars had somebody they were collaborating with. They could just come in for the day, and it's that kind of influx of energy and not quite knowing what a day might bring based on other people in a positive way that I really do miss, because as of now, this is my only companion in the studio, which is my dog Bax, and he's just not very talkative. This is him just being very asleep while I'm trying to work. But I did have something really nice that happened recently, which was somebody from Hampton University, where I got my architecture degree, reached out and said, hey, the fourth year class is coming in as for a trip, because we did these away trips. It would be a few weeks spent in a foreign location where you do a project based on that location. And it was Hong Kong and Thailand. But yeah, the school reached out and said, hey, are you there? Would you like to meet the students? So I had a really lovely day where they came to the studio. I took them down to see Mailing in her studio. She spoke to them about clothes. And, you know, it's really, I love these moments because I feel like it's a sense of giving back as well, and being able to just share where I've come from and to talk about connections, how important connections are. So the last thing I'm going to say is, it doesn't look like it's from here. It's something that has been said to me a lot about my work as a compliment. And it's a very difficult sentiment for me to sit with, because it means that what people are saying is that something that is from here, from the third world, from the Caribbean, from a not so developed space, shouldn't be looking this good. It looks like it's from somewhere else. So one of the huge motivating factors of my practice is to have people say, wow, this looks great, and just leave it at that. You know, just drop the from here. Working on telling stories of people from the Caribbean, working on producing high quality things that are from here, so that we can try to dispel this idea of what things from here should look like. And it's central to my practice. I'm gonna just keep producing quality work until people just drop this sentiment altogether. Hopefully it's gonna take a long time. I think there's a lot of mental blocks. There are a lot of factors that are going against it, but I mean, we try, we do what we can. So that's kind of the central motivating factor of my practice. And that brings me to the end So I just want to say thank you for listening, particularly thanks to Professor Raymond and all of the collaborators and friends who were mentioned here. And I also want to give a shout out to my friend Sean, who's put together a great playlist on Spotify. I've given you his name. If you want to feel that Caribbean vibe, you can just look him up. It's under my name, the playlist. So thank you, everyone. And yeah, that's it from me.
Hey, that was beautiful, Melanie. Thank you so much. What a lovely, lovely, rich story. So much knowledge there. And I love the way that you created the arc of your practice, the history of it, the formation of it, and also the beautiful things that you've produced and the context that they're produced in. So congratulations. I think it's really, really a lovely, very much, I think, what I envisage for this lecture series in terms of people exposing it, and a lovely mix of the work itself, as well as the stories behind the work. So thank you. So what we do now, so what we do now is we have some questions and answers. Anybody that's had any thoughts or reflections whilst they've been looking at your presentation has the chance to raise them. There are some in the chat, some nice comments, lots of lovely comments, very refreshing. Thanks for sharing your story. Somebody saying, I love the tagging system. Veronica King says, thank you, Melanie, for sharing your inspiring story. I'm impressed, so impressed with your multidisciplinary creativity. Are there projects where you find these disciplines intersect in some way? So I'll just run that again. I'm so impressed with your multidisciplinary creativity. Are there projects where you find these disciplines intersect in some ways? That's a lovely question.
Yeah, it is. So thank you for that question. I think the ones that have stood out the most have been, so for instance, I started working with Y Art Gallery. I didn't talk about them much, but they're one of the other galleries in Woodbrook. And I was asked then to curate an exhibition, to kind of come up with an idea for an exhibition series. So what I would have done there is I would have curated, but I also would have worked on designing the catalog and also writing, so writing about art. So there are some projects where there is that intersection, yes, and also, you know, something like A to Z of Caribbean art, even though I was primarily the editor with Mariel, I also got some writing in there, you know, and then I would do some of the graphics for socials if Richard can work on them. So I think those larger projects provide that opportunity for all of those things. But I sometimes, you know, don't necessarily welcome it, because while it is good, I like the opportunity to kind of step back and stay focused on one aspect of it. But yeah, it does happen. It does happen.
Hey, thank you, and thanks for the question, Veronica. And I see Catlejo has a hand up. Catlejo, would you like to go ahead and let us see you and ask your question to Melanie?
Hi. Hello, Melanie.
Hi.
First of all, Raymond, Tumelo and the team, thank you very much for these lectures. I would like to say you have reinvigorated an architectural practitioner in me, because it's tough. So thank you very much.
It is. I remember it's tough.
So Melanie, what I'm interested in asking, one of the challenges that we face in South Africa as practitioners is that the body corporate, I'll call it, it's called SACAP, it limits what practitioners can do. And what I'm hearing from your presentation is that we need to dream bigger than like what institutions tell us. So what advice do you have for people who are, say, in the lower tiers, who would like to get up there and are challenged by economy? Because as someone who's already practicing, obviously I cannot leave what I'm doing to go study. And we have limited opportunities in terms of studying while working in South Africa. So my question is around that. I've already picked up a lot of the answer in what you said in the presentation, that you need to keep pushing as far as you can go. So
Yeah.
thank you very much. That's my question.
You're welcome. You do need to keep pushing. I think one of the things that was really important to me, because I didn't know where I was pushing to, I didn't have any sense of, oh, I want to be this, or I want to be this, or I want to go in this direction. What I did was I just tried to remain as open as possible. You know, one of the key things for me was just going to everything I could go to, meeting people I could meet. One of the great things that I thought was really touching, actually, is everybody I reached out to, somebody who was doing something kind of interesting, and I would reach out to them, I would pay them a compliment about what they were doing, and then I would just say, could you meet with me for a coffee? Or could you, I mean, I guess now it would be, could you just jump on a 15-minute Zoom? And I think people's willingness to be open and to share and to help. I mean, something may not come out of it that day, but you'll be in that person's mind. So I always think, you know, you just have to keep putting yourself out there. And I think that I joined Instagram 2 years ago, you know, which is kind of crazy. But one of the things that you know, I actually think it's kind of nice, because it means that the connections that I made, I didn't make them online. I made them through very specific, you know, reaching out. And I think Instagram makes us, or social media in general, can make us a little bit comfortable in terms of how we don't put ourselves out there and interacting with people. So I don't know if that helps to answer your question.
Yes, no, thank you very much.
Yeah, hey, you're welcome.
Thanks for your question. A good prompt for Melanie. A few more comments. I'll just read them out. Interesting and great presentation from Anirudh. Mahru Bodwa says, great presentation of body of work. Thank you for sharing. Interesting career path. Thanks for the presentation. And then from Lee Hutton, Lee says, thank you very much for sharing your journey and your process. I find it truly inspiring. I myself am in a world between art and architecture, and it's wonderful to have experienced yours. So thank you for sharing. Merkin, what an inspiring story. Jayesh says, thank you. And then we have a question from Sipamandla. And Sipamandla says, have you had any doubts moving through your journey? A sense of imposter syndrome? And if so, how did you deal with that, moving through different mediums of design? And what advice do you have for someone who wants to explore different avenues?
Imposter syndrome. Why, just this morning, no, I cannot describe what a wreck I have been preparing for this talk. And I think, you know, I just have to keep reminding myself, it goes back to that idea of you're already a designer and you just need to figure out how you're going to be this thing in this particular space. It was really a great moment because it was backed up by, you know, the publication of a book. And I have those moments all the time, absolutely, constantly, all the time. It's something that my professors, Ron and Sally, said to me in architecture school. They said, you know, you're doing things intuitively and you have to learn how to just trust what, you know, what is coming out of you, because you're obviously a designer. The skill is there. I'm sure this is the same for you. And it's just a matter of you're making a decision every day. Sometimes I feel like I just make a decision to say that what I'm doing makes sense. And I'm constantly, I mean, the kicking and screaming, when I say I moved back to Trinidad kicking and screaming, I mean, my friend had to come over and help me pack my things because I was not packing anything. I was not going anywhere because I didn't, like, how could I work on, like, I didn't know what I was doing. But everything I have done has been, it's been that way. And I think once you do that enough, then you can start convincing yourself that you're not an imposter. It creeps in, but then, you know, I had one of my therapists, my most recent one, she's really stuck, but she always says to me, you know, put put your thoughts on trial. And when I start thinking, well, I can't do this, I can't possibly give this lecture. And then I just take it back and I think, okay, well, why can't you do it? What's holding you back? So yeah, I hope that answers your question. But yes, every day. And also just to get into things. I mean, the thing about trying something is if it doesn't work, then it doesn't work, but you've tried it and right? Which I think is important.
Yeah, thanks for that, Melanie. Nice response. I think that imposter syndrome is something that I think a lot of creative people are confronted with a lot. And maybe it's part of our work as creative people to sort of negotiate that. It's in a way, it's a way of questioning yourself.
Yeah.
Which is what you do.
So as long as it doesn't stop you.
Yes, exactly. So another comment. Let's have a look. Lyndon says, this was such a brilliant walk through your practice, Melanie, and the beautiful relationships and objects that guide and inspire you. Is there space or lessons you've learned from the unbeautiful, the aesthetically difficult, what might be called a push against the pleasing? And that's a difficult question. But so I'll read it again. It was a brilliant talk. And the question is there space or lessons you've learned from the unbeautiful, the aesthetically difficult, what might be called a push against the pleasing?
The aesthetically difficult. Well, I think that's, sometimes when you're working on client work, it can go in a few directions, some of them being really not good. And one of the things that I think is not everything makes it into the portfolio, on the website, on Instagram, into the talk. I think that, I mean, I've made some mistakes. I have made some mistakes that no one will ever see. And one of the things that they've been really good for is that they've helped me to put some sort of stop or some sort of process in place to ensure that these things don't happen again. But I think I usually feel as though if there's too much friction in a process, if there's too much standing between me and a beautiful product, then I kind of feel like, somehow this wasn't the thing for me, because my aim is to create things of beauty. And I don't imagine, I just kind of feel like, maybe it just was the wrong thing. And those moments have been fewer and fewer as I've gotten more certain about my practice. And now I say no to a lot more things than I say yes to, because I can see that kind of tension coming, and I don't like it. And also just the non-beautiful in terms of the behavior of others has also been a lesson, but that has just meant, a kind of more rigorous vetting process for the energy that I keep around me, because I think that people who want to produce something beautiful are the people I want to work with. And not just beautiful, but kindness is also very important to me. I want to work with people who are kind. You don't necessarily have to be nice all the time, but you have to be kind. But yeah, as I say, live it, learn it.
Yeah, nice, very good. So there are two more questions, and then I think we'll close off. First one is from Pinder, who's a student at the Graduate School of Architecture, and she says, I enjoyed the presentation. I found it to be very unique to you, and in some ways I hope to get into a practice that will be best suited to me. Thank you for your presentation and sharing your story with us. And Kolisi Makubo, who's a Unit 28 lead at the GSA, his is a comment. We'll close on, a nice way to finish. He says, amazing and inspiring presentation, Melanie. It's a great reminder to keep saying yes. I also enjoyed how you emphasized the point about your community of practice and collaborators. It seems so obvious, but it's something that is so easy to forget. I'll be tuning into the playlist after this.
Yay!
This is also a DJ.
Great.
So listen, on that,
amazing.
Yeah, on that note, I just want to thank you so much for what was a really beautiful, captivating, hypnotic presentation. You had a propitious title was delighted to learn that I inspired it. I've been telling people what a lovely title it is all day, but well done. It was really, really, really wonderful. I'd also like to thank the team here, Boitumelo, Leslie, Denise, Gabby, Adeshni, all the people who work behind the scenes at making this happen, and Fred for his wonderful work, for making this the fourth in the series happen. And thank you so much. And a reminder to everybody. Yeah, thank you, Melanie. And a reminder to everybody that the next one will be in the 13th of August. Angelan Fal, who's Unit 7 lead at the GSA, will be making a presentation. Please come and tune in and hear what she has to say about her practice. And I think we have a couple more in the series after that. Marlon Dabo, who is a colleague and friend of Melanie and myself in Trinidad, will also be talking about his practice. So we've got some really interesting events coming up in the series. I'm looking forward to seeing you all here again. And the recording, these are all recorded. So if there's something interesting, or if you missed part of this for whatever, you can watch it on the YouTube channel GSA Online. And on that note, Melanie, thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure having you with us this evening.
Mark. Thank you. And thank you to everyone at the GSA and to everybody who showed up. I really appreciate it. I take nothing for granted. So thank you.
Lovely. Thank you, Melanie. Thanks, everybody.
Okay.
Bye.
Take care. Bye.